Volume 2, The Life of Greece, Part 1, by Will Durant. Copyright 1939 by Will Durant. Copyright renewed 1966 by Will Durant. This recording of the full-length reading of The Life of Greece was published by arrangement with Monica Ariel Mehel, trustee Ethel B. Durant Trust, Monica Ariel Mehel and William James Durant Easton, and was produced in 1994 by Books on Tape Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Neither this recording nor any part thereof may be reproduced or used for any purpose without prior written authority from Books on Tape Incorporated. This book is read by Alexander Adams. Please observe the following procedures as you listen to these tapes. If you have borrowed this book from your local library, please return it to them at the end of the agreed period. If you are one of our regular rental customers, you may keep this book for 30 days from date of receipt by you, but after that time we charge additional rental of 25 cents per day. Dates are checked by postmark. Please return this book at the earliest possible time so another subscriber can have the use of this recording. To return cassettes to us, make sure they are all packaged in their plastic cassette cases and in proper order in the mailing container. Kindly seal the mailing container for return. Postage is already paid. Drop in any mailbox for return to Books on Tape. Should a cassette fail to play properly, hold it flat in the palm of your hand and slap it smartly against a hard flat surface. If this does not work, or if you cannot otherwise free the reels, and if you are a library customer, please ask your local library to contact Books on Tape for a replacement cassette. If you are one of our rental customers, please call us at our regular customer service number. Give us the name of the book and number of the cassette. We will immediately send you a replacement at no charge. Discard the broken cassette. The Life of Greece, Part 1, by Will Durant. This book consists of 30 chapters and is 671 pages long. The following material appears on the dust jacket of the book. In this magnificent survey of the culture of ancient Greece, you will discover the mysterious lost civilization of the island of Crete, land of the Minotaur and the Labyrinth, the violent society of Homer's Iliad, the rise of classical Greece, a society of traders and navigators, explorers and colonists, soldiers, sailors, and settlers, the origins of democracy and the political legacy to the Western world, the heroic battles against the Persians at Marathon and Salamis to preserve independence, tiny Greece in rebellion against the imperial tyranny from the East, the golden age of Athens, its architecture, poetry, dance, masked drama, religious mysteries, sculpture, and Olympic contests, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and the birth of the Academy, the blossoming of philosophical thought amid a society still rooted in slavery and barbarism, Alexander the Great, the soldier king who was Aristotle's pupil, who could mount a chariot at full speed, who tamed the giant horse Bucephalus, who fought the enemy hand-to-hand beside his own troops, who traveled from northern Greece across the Near East, Iraq, and Persia to India, and died, having conquered it all in 9 years. The end of Greece's golden age in a bloodbath of civil war and disorder, and the collapse of democracy. In the course of his dynamic synthesis of world history, Will Durant attacks in this volume the absorbing, perennially fascinating problem of Greek civilization. The Life of Greece, Volume 2 of the Story of Civilization, is a large, generous book whose style recalls the golden age of historical writing, before specialization had invaded the field. Dr. Durant tells the whole story of Hellas, from the days of Crete's vast Aegean empire to the extirpation of the last remnants of Greek liberty, crushed under the heel of an implacably forward-marching Rome. The dry minutiae of battles and sieges, of tortuous statecraft of tyrant and king, are given less emphasis in what is preeminently a vivid recreation of Greek culture, brought to the reader through the medium of a supple and vigorous prose. Will Durant looked at the life of Greece and looked at it whole, quite as whole indeed as a cultivated 5th-century Athenian, with his eager, constantly searching mind, looked at the superb panorama of Periclean Athens. The best insight into Dr. Durant's method of writing history can be found in the following sentence from the section on the age of Pericles. When Pericles, Aspasia, Phidias, Anaxagoras, and Socrates attended a play by Euripides in the theater of Dionysus, Athens could see visibly the zenith and unity of the life of Greece. Statesmanship, art, science, philosophy, literature, religion, and morals, living no separate career as in the pages of chroniclers, but woven into one many-colored fabric of a nation's history. The familiar analogy between Athens and the great modern democracies is fruitfully enlarged upon in the life of Greece. The astute Pericles had to face much the same sort of problems that the astute Franklin D. Roosevelt had to face in the 1930s. The building of the Parthenon was part of Pericles' WPA program. Many lived on the dole, and the administration of the dole money was not without its scandals. Taxation and tax evasion were both as ingenious as they are today. The class war, family limitation, sexual freedom, and the conflict between religion and science played their part in a civilization resembling our own in everything except machines. The life of Greece teems with epigram and wit and a philosopher's considered judgment. A nation is born stoic and dies Epicurean. The games of the young are as old as the sins of their fathers. This persistent effort to subordinate fancy to reason is the dominant quality of the Greek mind, even of Greek poetry. Therefore, Greek literature is modern, or rather contemporary. We find it hard to understand Dante or Milton, but Euripides and Thucydides are kin to us mentally, and belong to our age. And that is because, though myths may differ, reason remains the same, and the life of reason makes brothers of its lovers in all times and everywhere. Like a great drama, the life of Greece finds a climax in 5th century Athens, and Will Durant's picture of the city of Pericles is a masterpiece of synthesis, compressing into about 200 pages the high spots and eternal significances of what many have considered the most fruitful epoch in history. Dedication. To my friend, Max Schott. Preface. My purpose is to record and contemplate the origin, growth, maturity, and decline of Greek civilization, from the oldest remains of Crete and Troy to the conquest of Greece by Rome. I wish to see and feel this complex culture, not only in the subtle and impersonal rhythm of its rise and fall, but in the rich variety of its vital elements, its ways of drawing a living from the land and of organizing industry and trade, its experiments with monarchy, aristocracy, democracy, dictatorship, and revolution, its manners and morals, its religious practices and beliefs, its education of children, and its regulation of the sexes and the family, its homes and temples, markets and theaters and athletic fields, its poetry and drama, its painting, sculpture, architecture, and music, its sciences and inventions, its superstitions and philosophies. I wish to see and feel these elements not in their theoretical and scholastic isolation, but in their living interplay as the simultaneous movements of one great cultural organism, with 100 organs and 100 million cells, but with one body and one soul. Excepting machinery, there is hardly anything secular in our culture that does not come from Greece. Schools, gymnasiums, arithmetic, geometry, history, rhetoric, physics, biology, anatomy, hygiene, therapy, cosmetics, poetry, music, tragedy, comedy, philosophy, theology, agnosticism, skepticism, stoicism, Epicureanism, ethics, politics, idealism, philanthropy, cynicism, tyranny, plutocracy, democracy. These are all Greek words for cultural forms seldom originated but in many cases first matured for good or evil by the abounding energy of the Greeks. All the problems that disturb us today, the cutting down of forests and the erosion of the soil, the emancipation of woman and the limitation of the family, the conservatism of the established and the experimentalism of the unplaced, in morals, music, and government, the corruptions of politics and the perversions of conduct, the conflict of religion and science, and the weakening of the supernatural supports of morality, the war of the classes, the nations, and the continents, the revolutions of the poor against the economically powerful rich, and of the rich against the politically powerful poor, the struggle between democracy and dictatorship, between individualism and communism, between the East and the West. All these agitated as if for our instruction the brilliant and turbulent life of ancient Hellas. There is nothing in Greek civilization that does not illuminate our own. We shall try to see the life of Greece both in the mutual interplay of its cultural elements and in the immense 5-act drama of its rise and fall. We shall begin with Crete and its lately resurrected civilization, because apparently from Crete, as well as from Asia, came that prehistoric culture of Mycenae and Tyrans, which slowly transformed the immigrating Achaeans and the invading Dorians into civilized Greeks. And we shall study for a moment the virile world of warriors and lovers, pirates and troubadours that has come down to us on the rushing river of Homer's verse. We shall watch the rise of Sparta and Athens under Lycurgus and Solon, and shall trace the colonizing spread of the fertile Greeks through all the isles of the Aegean, the coasts of Western Asia and the Black Sea, of Africa and Italy, Sicily, France, and Spain. We shall see democracy fighting for its life at Marathon, stimulated by its victory, organizing itself under Pericles, and flowering into the richest culture in history. We shall linger with pleasure over the spectacle of the human mind liberating itself from superstition, creating new sciences, rationalizing medicine, secularizing history, and reaching unprecedented peaks in poetry and drama, philosophy, oratory, history, and art. And we shall record with melancholy the suicidal end of the Golden Age in the Peloponnesian War. We shall contemplate the gallant effort of disordered Athens to recover from the blow of her defeat. Even her decline will be illustrious with the genius of Plato and Aristotle, Apelles and Praxiteles, Philip and Demosthenes, Diogenes and Alexander. Then, in the wake of Alexander's generals, we shall see Greek civilization, too powerful for its little peninsula, bursting its narrow bounds and overflowing again into Asia, Africa, and Italy, teaching the cult of the body and the intellect to the mystical Orient, reviving the glories of Egypt in Ptolemaic Alexandria, and enriching Rhodes with trade and art, developing geometry with Euclid at Alexandria and Archimedes at Syracuse, formulating in Zeno and Epicurus the most lasting philosophies in history, carving the Aphrodite of Melos, the Laocoon, the victory of Samothrace, and the altar of Pergamum, striving and failing to organize its politics into honesty, unity, and peace, sinking ever deeper into the chaos of civil and class war, exhausted in soil and loins and spirit, surrendering to the autocracy, quietism, and mysticism of the Orient, and at last almost welcoming those conquering Romans through whom dying Greece would bequeath to Europe her sciences, her philosophies, her letters, and her arts as the living cultural basis of our modern world. Acknowledgements. I am grateful to Mr. Wallace Brockway for his scholarly help at every stage of this work, to Miss Mary Kaufman, Miss Ethel Durant, and Mr. Louis Durant for aid in classifying the material, to Miss Regina Sands for her expert preparation of the manuscript, and to my wife for her patient encouragement and quiet inspiration. I am deeply indebted to Sir Gilbert Murray and to his publishers, the Oxford University Press, for permission to quote from his translations of Greek drama. These translations have enriched English literature. I am also indebted to the Oxford University Press for permission to quote from its excellent Oxford Book of Greek Verse in Translation. Chapter 1. Crete. 1. The Mediterranean. As we enter the fairest of all waters, leaving behind us the Atlantic and Gibraltar, we pass at once into the arena of Greek history. Like frogs around a pond, said Plato, we have settled down upon the shores of this sea. Even on these distant coasts, the Greeks founded precarious, barbarian-bound colonies many centuries before Christ. At Hemeroscopium and Dampurius in Spain, at Marseille and Nice in France, and almost everywhere in southern Italy and Sicily. Greek colonists established prosperous towns at Cyrene in northern Africa and at Naucratis in the delta of the Nile. Their restless enterprise stirred the islands of the Aegean and the coasts of Asia Minor then as in our century. All along the Dardanelles and the Sea of Marmara and the Black Sea they built towns and cities for their far-venturing trade. Mainland Greece was but a small part of the ancient Greek world. Why was it that the second group of historic civilizations took form on the Mediterranean, as the first had grown up along the rivers of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and India, as the third would flourish on the Atlantic, and as the fourth may appear on the shores of the Pacific? Was it the better climate of the lands washed by the Mediterranean? There, then as now, winter rains nourished the earth, and moderate frosts stimulated men. There, almost all the year round, one might live an open-air life under a warm but not enervating sun. And yet the surface of the Mediterranean coasts and islands is nowhere so rich as the alluvial valleys of the Ganges, the Indus, the Tigris, the Euphrates, or the Nile. The summer's drought may begin too soon or last too long, and everywhere a rocky basis lurks under the thin crust of the dusty earth. The temperate north and the tropic south are both more fertile than these historic lands, where patient peasants, weary of coaxing the soil, more and more abandoned tillage to grow olives and the vine. And at any moment, along one or another of 100 faults, Earthquakes might split the ground beneath men's feet and frighten them into a fitful piety. Climate did not draw civilization to Greece. Probably it has never made a civilization anywhere. What drew men into the Aegean was its islands. The islands were beautiful. Even a worried mariner must have been moved by the changing colors of those shadowed hills that rose like temples out of the reflecting sea. Today there are few sights lovelier on the globe, and sailing the Aegean one begins to understand why the men who peopled those coasts and isles came to love them almost more than life, and, like Socrates, thought exile bitterer than death. But further, the mariner was pleased to find that these island jewels were strewn in all directions, and at such short intervals that his ship, whether going between east and west or between north and south, would never be more than 40 miles from land. And since the islands, like the mainland ranges, were the mountain tops of a once continuous territory that had been gradually submerged by a pertinacious sea, some welcome peak always greeted the outlook's eye and served as a beacon to ships that had as yet no compass to guide them. Again, the movements of wind and water conspired to help the sailor reach his goal. A strong central current flowed from the Black Sea into the Aegean, and countercurrents flowed northward along the coasts, while the northeasterly Etesian winds blew regularly in the summer to help back to their southern ports the ships that had gone to fetch grain, fish, and furs from the Euxine Sea. Fog was rare in the Mediterranean, and the unfailing sunshine so varied the coastal winds that at almost any harbor, from spring to autumn, one might be carried out by a morning and brought back by an evening breeze. In these propitious waters, the acquisitive Phoenicians and the amphibious Greeks developed the art and science of navigation. Here they built ships for the most part larger or faster, and yet more easily handled than any that had yet sailed the Mediterranean. Slowly, despite pirates and harassing uncertainties, the water routes from Europe and Africa into Asia, through Cyprus, Sidon, and Tyre, or through the Aegean and the Black Sea, became cheaper than the long land routes, arduous and perilous, that had carried so much of the commerce of Egypt and the Near East. Trade took new lines, multiplied new populations, and created new wealth. Egypt, then Mesopotamia, then Persia withered. Phoenicia deposited an empire of cities along the African coast, in Sicily, and in Spain, and Greece blossomed like a watered rose. 2. The rediscovery of Crete. There is a land called Crete in the midst of the wine-dark sea, a fair, rich land begirt with water, and therein are many men past counting, and 90 cities. When Homer sang these lines, perhaps in the 9th century before our era, all dates in this volume are B.C. unless otherwise stated, or obviously A.D., Greece had almost forgotten, though the poet had not, that the island whose wealth seemed to him even then so great had once been wealthier still, that it had held sway with a powerful fleet over most of the Aegean and part of mainland Greece, and that it had developed 1,000 years before the siege of Troy, one of the most artistic civilizations in history. Probably it was this Aegean culture, as ancient to him as he is to us, that Homer recalled when he spoke of a golden age in which men had been more civilized and life more refined than in his own disordered time. The rediscovery of that lost civilization is one of the major achievements of modern archaeology. Here was an island 20 times larger than the largest of the Cyclades, pleasant in climate, varied in the products of its fields and once richly wooded hills, and strategically placed for trade or war midway between Phoenicia and Italy, between Egypt and Greece. Aristotle had pointed out how excellent this situation was and how it had enabled Minos to acquire the empire of the Aegean. But the story of Minos, accepted as fact by all classical writers, was rejected as legend by modern scholars, and until 60 years ago it was the custom to suppose, with Grote, that the history of civilization in the Aegean had begun with the Dorian invasion or the Olympic Games. Then, in A.D. 1878, a Cretan merchant, appropriately named Minos Kalakaironos, unearthed some strange antiquities on a hillside south of Candia. The great Schliemann, who had but lately resurrected Mycenae and Troy, visited the site in 1886, announced his conviction that it covered the remains of the ancient Knossos, and opened negotiations with the owner of the land so that excavations might begin at once. But the owner haggled and tried to cheat, and Schliemann, who had been a merchant before becoming an archaeologist, withdrew in anger, losing a golden chance to add another civilization to history. A few years later he died. In 1893, a British archaeologist, Dr. Arthur Evans, bought in Athens a number of milkstones from Greek women who had worn them as amulets. He was curious about the hieroglyphics engraved upon them, which no scholar could read. Tracing the stones to Crete, he secured passage thither, and wandered about the island, picking up examples of what he believed to be ancient Cretan writing. In 1895 he purchased a part, and in 1900 the remainder of the site that Schliemann and the French school at Athens had identified with Knossos, and in 9 weeks of that spring, digging feverishly with 150 men, he exhumed the richest treasure of modern historical research, the Palace of Minos. Nothing yet known from antiquity could equal the vastness of this complicated structure, to all appearances identical with the almost endless labyrinth so famous in old Greek tales of Minos, Daedalus, Theseus, Ariadne, and the Minotaur. In these and other ruins, as if to confirm Evans's intuition, thousands of seals and clay tablets were found, bearing characters like those that had set him upon the trail. The fires that had destroyed the palaces of Knossos had preserved these tablets, whose undeciphered pictographs and scripts still conceal the early story of the Aegean. Evans labored brilliantly at Knossos for many years, was knighted for his discoveries, and completed in 1936 his monumental 4-volume report, The Palace of Minos. Students from many countries now hurried to Crete. While Evans was working at Knossos, a group of resolute Italians, Albert, Bernier, Savignoni, Paribeni, unearthed at Hagia Triada, Holy Trinity, a sarcophagus painted with illuminating scenes from Cretan life, and uncovered at Festus a palace only less extensive than that of the Knossos kings. Meanwhile, 2 Americans, Seeger and Mrs. Hawes, made discoveries at Vasiliki, Moklos, and Gurnia. The British, Hogarth, Bosanquet, Dawkins, Myers, explored Palikastro, Sycro, and Zakro. The Cretans themselves became interested, and Xanthudidus and Hatsidicus dug up ancient residences, grottos, and tombs at Archelokori, Tylosus, Kumasa, and Kamaisi. Half the nations of Europe united under the flag of science in the very generation in which their statesmen were preparing for war. How was all this material to be classified? These palaces, paintings, statues, seals, vases, medals, tablets, and reliefs. To what period of the past were they to be assigned? Precariously, but with increasing corroboration as research went on and knowledge grew, Evans dated the relics according to the depth of their strata, the gradation of styles in the pottery, and the agreement of Cretan finds, in form or motive, with like objects exhumed in lands or deposits whose chronology was approximately known. Digging down patiently beneath Knossos, he found himself stopped, some 43 feet below the surface, by the virgin rock. The lower half of the excavated area was occupied by remains characteristic of the Neolithic age. Primitive forms of handmade pottery with simple linear ornament, spindle whores for spinning and weaving, fat-buttocked goddesses of painted steatite or clay, tools and weapons of polished stone, but nothing in copper or bronze. Classifying the pottery and correlating the remains with those of ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt, Evans divided the post-Neolithic and prehistoric culture of Crete into 3 ages, early, middle, and late Minoan, and each of these into 3 periods. The first or lowest appearance of copper in the strata represents for us, through a kind of archaeological shorthand, the slow rise of a new civilization out of the Neolithic age. By the end of the early Minoan age, the Cretans learned to mix copper with tin, and the Bronze Age begins. In Middle Minoan I, the earliest palaces occur. The princes of Knossos, Festus, and Mallia built for themselves luxurious dwellings with countless rooms, spacious storehouses, specialized workshops, altars, and temples, and great drainage conduits that startled the arrogant Occidental eye. Pottery takes on a many-colored brilliance, walls are enlivened with charming frescoes, and a form of linear script evolves out of the hieroglyphics of the preceding age. Then, at the close of Middle Minoan II, some strange catastrophe writes its cynical record into the strata. The palace of Knossos is laid low as if by a convulsion of the earth, or perhaps by an attack from Festus, whose palace for a time is spared. But a little later a like destruction falls upon Festus, Moklos, Gurnia, Palikastro, and many other cities in the island. The pottery is covered with ashes. The great jars in the storerooms are filled with debris. Middle Minoan III is a period of comparative stagnation, in which perhaps the southeastern Mediterranean world is long disordered by the Hyksos conquest of Egypt. In the late Minoan age, everything begins again. Humanity, patient under every cataclysm, renews its hope, takes courage, and builds once more. New and finer palaces rise at Knossos, Festus, Tylissus, Hagia Triada, and Gornia. The lordly spread, the 5-storied height, the luxurious decoration of these princely residences suggest such wealth as Greece would not know till Pericles. Theaters are erected in the palace courts, and gladiatorial spectacles of men and women in deadly combat with animals amuse gentlemen and ladies, whose aristocratic faces, quietly alert, still live for us on the bright frescoes of the resurrected walls. Wants are multiplied, tastes are refined, literature flourishes. 1,000 industries graciously permit the poor to prosper by supplying comforts and delicacies to the rich. The halls of the king are noisy with scribes, taking inventories of goods distributed or received, with artists making statuary, paintings, pottery, or reliefs, with high officials conducting conferences, hearing judicial appeals, or dispatching papers stamped with their finely wrought seals, while wasp-waisted princes and jeweled duchesses, alluringly décolletés, crowd to a royal feast served on tables shining with bronze and gold. The 16th and 15th centuries before our era are the zenith of Aegean civilization, the classic and golden age of Crete. 3. The reconstruction of a civilization. If now we try to restore this buried culture from the relics that remain, playing Cuvier to the scattered bones of Crete, let us remember that we are engaging upon a hazardous kind of historical television, in which imagination must supply the living continuity in the gaps of static and fragmentary material artificially moving but long since dead. Crete will remain inwardly unknown until its secretive tablets find their Champollion. 1. Men and Women. As we see them self-pictured in their art, the Cretans curiously resembled the double axe so prominent in their religious symbolism. Male and female alike have torsos narrowing pathologically to an ultra-modern waist. Nearly all are short in stature, slight and supple of build, graceful in movement, athletically trim. Their skin is white at birth. The ladies who court the shade have fair complexions, conventionally pale. But the men pursuing wealth under the sun are so tanned and ruddy that the Greeks will call them, as well as the Phoenicians, Phoenikes, the purple ones, redskins. The head is rather long than broad, the features are sharp and refined, the hair and eyes are brilliantly dark, as in the Italians of today. These Cretans are apparently a branch of the Mediterranean race. The men as well as the women wear their hair partly in coils on the head or the neck, partly in ringlets on the brow, partly in tresses falling upon the shoulders or the breast. The women add ribbons for their curls, while the men, to keep their faces clean, provide themselves with a variety of razors, even in the grave. The dress is as strange as the figures. On their heads, most often bare, men have turbans or tam-o'-shanters, the women magnificent hats of our early 20th century style. The feet are usually free of covering, but the upper classes may bind them in white leather shoes, which among women may daintily be embroidered at the edges, with colored beads on straps. Ordinarily the male has no clothing above the waist. There he wears a short skirt or waistcloth, occasionally with a codpiece for modesty. The skirt may be split at the side in working men. In dignitaries and ceremonies it reaches in both sexes to the ground. Occasionally the men wear drawers, and in winter a long outer garment of wool or skins. The clothing is tightly laced about the middle, for men as well as women are resolved to be, or seem, triangularly slim. To rival the men at this point, the women of the later periods resort to stiff corsets, which gather their skirts snugly around their hips and lift their bare breasts to the sun. It is a pretty custom among the Cretans that the female bosom should be uncovered or revealed by a diaphanous chemise. No one seems to take offense. The bodice is laced below the bust, opens in a careless circle, and then in a gesture of charming reserve may close in a Medici collar at the neck. The sleeves are short, sometimes puffed. The skirt, adorned with flounces and gray tints, widens out spaciously from the hips, stiffened presumably with metal ribs or horizontal hoops. There are in the arrangement and design of Cretan feminine dress a warm harmony of colors, a grace of line, a delicacy of taste, that suggest a rich and luxurious civilization, already old in arts and wiles. In these matters the Cretans have no influence upon the Greeks. Only in modern capitals have their styles triumphed. Even staid archaeologists have given the name La Parisienne to the portrait of a Cretan lady with profulgent bosom, shapely neck, sensual mouth, impudent nose, and a persuasive, provocative charm. She sits saucily before us today as part of a frieze in which high personages gaze upon some spectacle that we shall never see. The men of Crete are evidently grateful for the grace and adventure that women give to life, for they provide them with costly means of enhancing their loveliness. The remains are rich in jewelry of many kinds, hairpins of copper and gold, stickpins adorned with golden animals or flowers, or heads of crystal or quartz, rings or spirals of filigree gold mingling with the hair, fillets or diadems of precious metal binding it, rings and pendants hanging from the ear, plaques and beads and chains on the breast, bands and bracelets on the arm, finger rings of silver, steatite, agate, carnelian, amethyst, or gold. The men keep some of the jewelry for themselves. If they are poor, they carry necklaces and bracelets of common stones. If they can afford it, they flaunt great rings engraved with scenes of battle or the chase. The famous cupbearer wears on the biceps of his left arm a broad band of precious metal, and on the wrist a bangle inlaid with agate. Everywhere in Cretan life, man expresses his vainest and noblest passion, the zeal to beautify. This use of man, to signify all humanity, reveals the prejudice of a patriarchal age, and hardly suits the almost matriarchal life of ancient Crete. For the Minoan woman does not put up with any oriental seclusion, any purdah or harem. There is no sign of her being limited to certain quarters of the house or to the home. She works there, doubtless, as some women do even today. She weaves clothing and baskets, grinds grain, and bakes bread. But also she labors with men in the fields and the potteries. She mingles freely with them in the crowds. She takes the front seat at the theater and the games. She sweeps through Cretan society with the air of a great lady bored with adoration. And when her nation creates its gods, it is more often in her likeness than in man's. Sober students, secretly and forgivably enamored of the mother image in their hearts, bow down before her relics and marvel at her domination. 2. Society. Hypothetically, we picture Crete as at first an island divided by its mountains among petty jealous clans which live in independent villages under their own chiefs and fight, after the manner of men, innumerable territorial wars. Then a resolute leader appears who unites several clans into a kingdom and builds his fortress palace at Knossos, Festus, Tylissus, or some other town. The wars become less frequent, more widespread, and more efficient in killing. At last the cities fight for the entire island, and Knossos wins. The victor organizes a navy, dominates the Aegean, suppresses piracy, exacts tribute, builds palaces, and patronizes the arts, like an early Pericles. It is as difficult to begin a civilization without robbery as it is to maintain it without slaves. The power of the king, as echoed in the ruins, is based upon force, religion, and law. To make obedience easier, he suborns the gods to his use. His priests explain to the people that he is descended from Velkanos, and has received from this deity the laws that he decrees. And every 9 years, if he is competent or generous, they re-anoint him with the divine authority. To symbolize his power, the monarch, anticipating Rome and France, adopts the double axe and the fleur-de-lis. To administer the state, he employs, as the litter of tablets suggests, a staff of ministers, bureaucrats, and scribes. He taxes in kind, and stores in giant jars his revenues of grain, oil, and wine. And out of this treasury, in kind, he pays his men. From his throne in the palace or his judgment seat in the royal villa, he settles in person such litigation as has run the gauntlet of his appointed courts. And so great is his reputation as a magistrate that when he dies he becomes in Hades, Homer assures us, the inescapable judge of the dead. We call him Minos, but we do not know his name. Probably the word is a title, like Pharaoh or Caesar, and covers a multitude of kings. At its height, this civilization is surprisingly urban. The Iliad speaks of Crete's 90 cities, and the Greeks who conquer them are astonished at their teeming populations. Even today the student stands in awe before the ruined mazes of paved and guttered streets, intersecting lanes and countless shops or houses, crowding about some center of trade or government in all the huddled gregariousness of timid and talkative men. It is not only Knossos that is great, with palaces so vast that imagination perhaps exaggerates the town that must have been the chief source and beneficiary of their wealth. Across the island on the southern shore is Festus, from whose harbor, Homer tells us, the dark-prowed ships are borne to Egypt by the force of the wind and the wave. The southbound trade of Minoan Crete pours out here, swelled by goods from northern merchants who ship their cargoes overland to avoid a long detour by perilous seas. Festus becomes a Cretan Piraeus, in love with commerce rather than with art. And yet the palace of its prince is a majestic edifice, reached by a flight of steps 45 feet wide. Its halls and courts compare with those at Knossos. Its central court is a paved quadrangle of 10,000 square feet. Its Megaron, or reception room, is 3,000 square feet in area, larger even than the great Hall of the Double Axe in the northern capital. 2 miles northwest is Hagia Triada, in whose royal villa, as archaeological imagination calls it, the prince of Festus seeks refuge from the summer heat. The eastern end of the island, in Minoan days, is rich in small towns, ports like Zakro or Maklas, villages like Pressus or Syra, residential quarters like Palikastro, manufacturing centers like Gornia. The main street in Palikastro is well paved, well drained, and lined with spacious homes. One of these has 23 rooms on the surviving floor. Gornia boasts of avenues paved with gypsum, of homes built with mortarless stone, of a blacksmith's shop with extant forge, of a carpenter shop with a kit of tools, of small factories noisy with metalworking, shoemaking, vase-making, oil refining, or textile industry. The modern workmen who excavate it and gather up its tripods, jars, pottery, ovens, lamps, knives, mortars, polishers, hooks, pins, daggers, and swords, marvel at its varied products and equipment and call it He Mechanike Polis, the town of machinery. By our standards, the minor streets are narrow, mere alleys in the style of a semi-tropical Orient that fears the sun, and the rectangular houses of wood or brick or stone are for the most part confined to a single floor. Yet some middle Minoan plaques exhumed at Knossos show us homes of 2, 3, even 5 stories, with a cubical attic or turret here and there. On the upper floors in these pictured houses are windows with red panes of unknown material. Double doors, swinging on posts apparently of cypress wood, open from the ground floor rooms upon the shaded court. Stairways lead to the upper floors and the roof, where the Cretan sleeps when the nights are very warm. If he spends the evening indoors, he lights his room by burning oil, according to his income, in lamps of clay, steatite, gypsum, marble, or bronze. We know a trifle or two about the games he plays. At home he likes a form of chess, for he has bequeathed to us, in the ruins of the Knossos Palace, a magnificent gaming board with frame of ivory, squares of silver and gold, and a border of 72 daisies in precious metal and stone. In the fields he takes with zest and audacity to the chase, guided by half-wild cats and slender thoroughbred hounds. In the towns he patronizes pugilists, and on his vases and reliefs he represents for us a variety of contests, in which lightweights spar with bare hands and kicking feet, middleweights with plumed helmets batter each other manfully, and heavyweights, coddled with helmets, cheek-pieces, and long padded gloves, fight till one falls exhausted to the ground and the other stands above him in the conscious grandeur of victory. But the Cretan's greatest thrill comes when he wins his way into the crowd that fills the amphitheater on a holiday to see men and women face death against huge, charging bulls. Time and again he pictures the stages of this lusty sport. The daring hunter capturing the bull by jumping astride its neck as it laps up water from a pool, the professional tamer twisting the animal's head until it learns some measure of tolerance for the acrobat's annoying tricks, the skilled performer, slim and agile, meeting the bull in the arena, grasping its horns, leaping into the air, somersaulting over its back, and landing feet first on the ground in the arms of a female companion who lends her grace to the scene. Even in Minoan Crete this is already an ancient art. A clay cylinder from Cappadocia, ascribed to 2400 B.C., shows a bull-grappling sport as vigorous and dangerous as in these frescoes. For a moment our oversimplifying intellects catch a glimpse of the contradictory complexity of man as we perceive that this game of bloodlust and courage, still popular today, is as old as civilization. 3. Religion. The Cretan may be brutal, but he is certainly religious, with a thoroughly human mixture of fetishism and superstition, idealism and reverence. He worships mountains, caves, stones, the number 3, trees and pillars, sun and moon, goats and snakes, doves and bulls. Hardly anything escapes his theology. He conceives the air as filled with spirits, genial or devilish, and hands down to Greece a sylvan ethereal population of dryads, Silene, and nymphs. He does not directly adore the phallic emblem, but he venerates with awe the genitive vitality of the bull and the snake. Since his death rate is high, he pays devout homage to fertility, and when he rises to the notion of a human divinity, He pictures a mother goddess with generous mammy and sublime flanks, with reptiles creeping up around her arms and breasts, coiled in her hair, or rearing themselves proudly from her head. He sees in her the basic fact of nature, that man's greatest enemy, death, is overcome by woman's mysterious power, reproduction, and he identifies this power with deity. The mother goddess represents for him the source of all life, in plants and animals as well as in men. If he surrounds her image with fauna and flora, it is because these exist through her creative fertility, and therefore serve as her symbols and her emanations. Occasionally she appears holding in her arms her divine child, Velkanos, whom she has borne in a mountain cave. Contemplating this ancient image, we see through it Isis and Horus, Ishtar and Tammuz, Cybele and Attis, Aphrodite and Adonis, and feel the unity of prehistoric culture and the continuity of religious ideas and symbols in the Mediterranean world. The Cretan Zeus, as the Greeks call Velkanos, is subordinate to his mother in the affections of the Cretans, but he grows in importance. He becomes the personification of the fertilizing rain, of the moisture that in this religion, as in the philosophy of Thales, underlies all things. He dies, and his sepulchre is shown from generation to generation on Mount Euctas, where the majestic profile of his face can still be seen by the imaginative traveler. He rises from the grave as a symbol of reviving vegetation, and the Kuratese priests celebrate with dances and clashing shields his glorious resurrection. Sometimes, as a god of fertility, he is conceived as incarnate in the sacred bull. It is as a bull that he mates in Cretan myth with Minos's wife Pasiphae, and begets by her the monstrous Minos bull, or Minotaur. To appease these deities, the Cretan uses a lavish rite of prayer and sacrifice, symbol and ceremony, administered usually by women priests, sometimes by officials of the state. To ward off demons, he burns incense. To arouse a negligent divinity, he sounds the conch, plays the flute or the lyre, and sings, in chorus, hymns of adoration. To promote the growth of orchards and the fields, he waters trees and plants in solemn ritual, or his priestesses in nude frenzy shake down the ripe burden of the trees. Or his women in festal procession carry fruits and flowers as hints and tribute to the goddess, who was born in state in a palanquin. He has apparently no temple, but raises altars in the palace court, in sacred groves or grottos, and on mountain tops. He adorns these sanctuaries with tables of libation and sacrifice, a medley of idols, and horns of consecration, perhaps representative of the sacred bull. He is profuse with holy symbols, which he seems to worship along with the gods whom they signify. First the shield, presumably as the emblem of his goddess in her warrior form, then the cross, in both its Greek and its Roman shapes, and as the swastika, cut upon the forehead of a bull or the thigh of a goddess, or carved upon seals, or raised in marble in the palace of the king. Above all, the double axe, as an instrument of sacrifice magically enriched with the virtue of the blood that it sheds, or as a holy weapon unerringly guided by the god, or even as a sign of Zeus the thunderer cleaving the sky with his bolts. Finally, he offers a modest care and worship to his dead. He buries them in clay coffins or massive jars, for if they are unburied they may return. To keep them content below the ground, he deposits with them modest portions of food, articles for their toilet, and clay figurines of women to tend or console them through all eternity. Sometimes, with the sly economy of an incipient skeptic, he substitutes clay animals in the grave in place of actual food. If he buries a king or a noble or a rich trader, he surrenders to the corpse a part of the precious plate or jewelry that it once possessed. With touching sympathy, he buries a set of chess with a good player, a clay orchestra with a musician, a boat with one who loved the sea. Periodically, he returns to the grave to offer a sustaining sacrifice of food to the dead. He hopes that in some secret Elysium, or islands of the blessed, the just god Rhadamanthus, son of Zeus Velkanos, will receive the purified soul, and give it the happiness and the peace that slip so elusively through the fingers in this earthly quest. 4. Culture. The most troublesome aspect of the Cretan is his language. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now. The Story of Civilization, Volume 2, The Life of Greece, Part 1, by Will Durant. Continued. Cassette 1, Side 2. The most troublesome aspect of the Cretan is his language. When, after the Dorian invasion, he uses the Greek alphabet, it is for a speech completely alien to what we know as Greek, and more akin in sound to the Egyptian, Cypriot, Hittite, and Anatolian dialects of the Near East. In the earliest age, he confines himself to hieroglyphics. About 1800 B.C., he begins to shorten these into a linear script of some 90 syllabic signs. 2 centuries later, he contrives another script, whose characters often resemble those of the Phoenician alphabet. Perhaps it is from him, as well as from the Egyptians and the Semites, that the Phoenicians gather together those letters they will scatter throughout the Mediterranean to become the unassuming, omnipresent instrument of Western civilization. Even the common Cretan composes, and, like some privy councillor, leaves on the walls of Hagia Triada the passing inspirations of his muse. At Festus we find a kind of prehistoric printing, the hieroglyphs of a great disk unearthed there from Middle Minoan III strata are impressed upon the clay by stamps, one for each pictograph. But here, to add to our befuddlement, the characters are apparently not Cretan, but foreign. Perhaps the disk is an importation from the East. The clay tablets upon which the Cretan writes may someday reveal to us his accomplishments in science. He has some astronomy, for he is famed as a navigator, and tradition hands down to Dorian Crete the ancient Minoan calendar. The Egyptians acknowledge their indebtedness to him for certain medical prescriptions, and the Greeks borrow from him, as the words suggest, such aromatic and medicinal herbs as mint, mintha, wormwood, absinthon, and an ideal drug, dalkos, reputed to cure obesity without disturbing gluttony. But we must not mistake our guessing for history. Though the Cretan's literature is a sealed book to us, we may at least contemplate the ruins of his theaters. At Festus, about 2000, he builds 10 tiers of stone seats, running some 80 feet along a wall overlooking a flagged court. At Knossos he raises, again in stone, 18 tiers 33 feet long, and at right angles to them 6 tiers from 18 to 50 feet in length. These court theaters, seating 400 or 500 persons, are the most ancient playhouses known to us, older by 1,500 years than the theater of Dionysus. We do not know what took place on those stages. Frescoes picture audiences viewing a spectacle, but we cannot tell what it is that they see. Very likely it is some combination of music and dance. A painting from Knossos preserves a group of aristocratic ladies, surrounded by their gallants, watching a dance by gaily petticoated girls in an olive grove. Another represents a dancing woman with flying tresses and extended arms. Others show us rustic folk dances, or the wild dance of priests, priestesses, and worshippers before an idol or a sacred tree. Homer describes the dancing floor which once, in broad Knossos, Daedalus made for Ariadne of the lovely hair. There youths and seductive maidens join hands in the dance, and a divine bard sets the time to the sound of the lyre. The 7-stringed lyre, ascribed by the Greeks to the inventiveness of Terpander, is represented on a sarcophagus at Hagia Triada 1,000 years before Terpander's birth. There, too, is the double flute, with 2 pipes, 8 holes, and 14 notes, precisely as in classical Greece. Carved on a gem, a woman blows a trumpet made from an enormous conch, and on a vase we see the sistrum beating time for the dancer's feet. The same youthful freshness and light-hearted grace that animate his dances and his games enliven the Cretan's work in the arts. He has not left us, aside from his architecture, any accomplishments of massive grandeur or exalted style. Like the Japanese of samurai days, he delights rather in the refinement of the lesser and more intimate arts, the adornment of objects daily used, the patient perfecting of little things. As in every aristocratic civilization, he accepts conventions in the form and subject of his work, avoids extravagant novelties, and learns to be free even within the limitations of reserve and taste. He excels in pottery, gem-cutting, bezel carving, and reliefs, for here his microscopic skill finds every stimulus and opportunity. He is at home in the working of silver and gold, sets all the precious stones, and makes a rich diversity of jewels. Upon the seals that he cuts to serve as official signatures, commercial labels, or business forms, he engraves in delicate detail so much of the life and scenery of Crete that from them alone we might picture his civilization. He hammers bronze into basins, ewers, daggers, and swords, ornamented with floral and animal designs, and inlaid with gold and silver, ivory, and rare stones. At Gornia he has left us, despite the thieves of 30 centuries, a silver cup of finished artistry, and here and there he has molded for us rhytons, or drinking horns, rising out of human or animal heads that to this day seem to hold the breath of life. As a potter he tries every form, and reaches distinction in nearly all of them. He makes vases, dishes, cups, chalices, lamps, jars, animals, and gods. At first, in early Minoan, he is content to shape the vessel with his hands along lines bequeathed to him from the Neolithic age, to paint it with a glaze of brown or black, and to trust the fire to mottle the color into haphazard tints. In Middle Minoan he has learned the use of the wheel, and rises to the height of his skill. He makes a glaze rivaling the consistency and delicacy of porcelain. He scatters recklessly black and brown, white and red, orange and yellow, crimson and vermilion, and mingles them happily into novel shades. He finds down the clay with such confident thoroughness that in his most perfect product, the graceful and brightly colored eggshell wares found in the cave of Camares at Mount Ida's slopes, he has dared to thin the walls of the vessel to a millimeter's thickness, and to pour out upon it all the motifs of his rich imagination. From 2100 to 1950 is the apogee of the Cretan potter. He signs his name to his work, and his trademark is sought throughout the Mediterranean. In the late Minoan age he brings to full development the technique of faience, and forms the brilliant paste into decorative plaques, vases of turquoise blue, polychrome goddesses, and marine reliefs so realistic that Evans mistook an enamel crab for a fossil. Now the artist falls in love with nature, and delights to represent on his vessels the liveliest animals, the gaudiest fish, the most delicate flowers, and the most graceful plants. It is in late Minoan I that he creates his surviving masterpieces, the boxer's vase and the harvester's vase. In the one he presents us crudely with every aspect and attitude of the pugilistic game, adding a zone of scenes from the bull-leaper's life. In the other he follows with fond fidelity a procession probably of peasants marching and singing in some harvest festival. Then the great tradition of Cretan pottery grows weak with age, and the art declines. Reserve and taste are forgotten, decoration overruns the vase in bizarre irregularity and excess, the courage for slow conception and patient execution breaks down, and a lazy carelessness called freedom replaces the finesse and finish of the Camares age. It is a forgivable decay, the unavoidable death of an old and exhausted art, which will lie in refreshing sleep for 1,000 years, and be reborn in the perfection of the Attic vase. Sculpture is a minor art in Crete, and except in bas-relief and the story of Daedalus, seldom graduates from the statuette. Many of these little figures are stereotyped crudities, seemingly produced by rote. One is a delightful snapshot in ivory of an athlete plunging through the air. Another is a handsome head that has lost its body on the way down the centuries. The best of them excels in anatomical precision and in vividness of action, anything that we know from Greece before Myron's time. The strangest is the snake goddess of the Boston Museum, a sturdy figure of ivory and gold, half mammy and half snakes. Here at last the Cretan artist treats the human form with some amplitude and success. But when he essays a larger scale, he falls back for the most part upon animals, and confines himself to painted reliefs, as in the bull's head in the Heracleum Museum. In this startling relic, the fixed wild eyes, the snorting nostrils, the gasping mouth, and the trembling tongue achieve a power that Greece itself will never surpass. Nothing else in ancient Crete is quite so attractive as its painting. The sculpture is negligible, the pottery is fragmentary, the architecture is in ruins, but this frailest of all the arts, easy victim of indifferent time, has left us legible and admirable masterpieces from an age so old that it slipped quite out of the memory of that classic Greece whose painting, by contrast so recent, not one original remains. In Crete, the earthquakes or the wars that overturned the palaces preserved here and there a frescoed wall, and wandering by them we molt 40 centuries and meet the men who decorated the rooms of the Minoan kings. As far back as 2500 they make wall coatings of pure lime and conceive the idea of painting in fresco upon the wet surface, wielding the brush so rapidly that the colors sink into the stucco before the surface dries. Into the dark halls of the palaces they bring the bright beauty of the open fields. They make plaster sprout lilies, tulips, narcissi, and sweet marjoram. No one viewing these scenes could ever again suppose that nature was discovered by Rousseau. In the museum at Heracleum, the saffron picker is as eager to pluck the crocus as when his creator painted him in Middle Minoan days. His waist is absurdly thin, his body seems much too long for his legs, and yet his head is perfect, the colors are soft and warm, the flowers still fresh after 4,000 years. At Hagia Triada, the painter brightens a sarcophagus with spiral scrolls and queer, almost Nubian figures engrossed in some religious ritual. Better yet, he adorns a wall with waving foliage, and then places in the midst of it, darkly but vividly, a stout, tense cat preparing to spring unseen upon a proud bird preening its plumage in the sun. In late Minoan, the Cretan painter is at the top of his stride. Every wall tempts him, every plutocrat calls him. He decorates not merely the royal residences, but the homes of nobles and burghers with all the lavishness of Pompeii. Soon, however, success and a surfeit of commissions spoil him. He is too anxious to be finished to quite touch perfection. He scatters quantity about him, repeats his flowers monotonously, paints his men impossibly, contents himself with sketching outlines, and falls into the lassitude of an art that knows that it has passed its zenith and must die. But never before, except perhaps in Egypt, has painting looked so freshly at the face of nature. All the arts come together to build the Cretan palaces. Political power, commercial mastery, wealth and luxury, accumulated refinement and taste commandeer the architect, the builder, the artisan, the sculptor, the potter, the metalworker, the woodworker, and the painter, to fuse their skills in producing an assemblage of royal chambers, administrative offices, court theaters, and arenas, to serve as the center and summit of Cretan life. They build in the 21st century, and the 20th sees their work destroyed. They build again in the 17th, not only the palace of Minos, but many other splendid edifices at Knossos, and in 100 other cities in the thriving land. It is one of the great ages in architectural history. The creators of the Knossos palace are limited in both materials and men. Crete is poor in metal and quite devoid of marble. Therefore they build with limestone and gypsum, and use wood for entablatures, roofs, and all columns above the basement floor. They cut the stone blocks so sharply that they can put them together without mortar. Around a central court of 20,000 square feet, they raise to 3 or 4 stories, with spacious stairways of stone, a rambling maze of rooms. Guardhouses, workshops, wine press, storerooms, administrative offices, servants' quarters, anterooms, reception rooms, bedrooms, bathrooms, chapel, dungeon, throne room, and a hall of the double axe, adding nearby the conveniences of a theater, a royal villa, and a cemetery. On the lowest floor they plant massive square pillars of stone. On the upper floors they use circular columns of cypress, tapering strangely downward, to support the ceilings upon smooth round capitals, or to form shady porticos at the side. Safe in the interior, against a gracefully decorated wall, they set a stone seat, simply but skillfully carved, which eager diggers will call the throne of Minos, and on which every tourist will modestly seat himself and be for a moment some inches a king. This sprawling palace in all likelihood is the famous labyrinth, or sanctuary of the double axe, or labrys, attributed by the ancients to Daedalus, and destined to give its name in after-time to any maze, of rooms, or words, or ears. As if to please the modern spirit, more interested in plumbing than in poetry, the builders of Knossos install in the palace a system of drainage superior to anything else of its kind in antiquity. They collect in stone conduits the water that flows down from the hills or falls from the sky, direct it through shafts to the bathrooms and latrines, and lead off the waste in terracotta pipes of the latest style, each section 6 inches in diameter and 30 inches long, equipped with a trap to catch the sediment, tapering at one end to fit into the next section, and bound to this firmly with a necking of cement. Possibly they include an apparatus for supplying running hot water to the household of the king. Maso found similar drainage pipes in the villa at Hagia Triada. One day, after a heavy downpour of rain, I was interested to find that all the drains acted perfectly, and I saw the water flow from the sewers, through which a man could walk upright. I doubt if there is any other instance of a drainage system acting after 4,000 years. To the complex interiors, the artists of Knossos add the most delicate decorations. Some of the rooms they adorn with vases and statuettes, some with paintings or reliefs, some with huge stone amphorae or massive urns, some with objects in ivory, faience, or bronze. Around one wall they run a limestone frieze with pretty triglyphs and half-rosettes. Around another a panel of spirals and frets on a surface painted to simulate marble. Around another they carve in high relief and living detail the contests of man and bull. Through the halls and the chambers the Minoan painter spreads all the glories of his cheerful art. Here, caught chattering in a drawing-room, are ladies in blue, with classic features, shapely arms, and cozy breasts. Here are fields of lotus, or lilies, or olive spray. Here are ladies at the opera, and dolphins swimming motionlessly in the sea. Here, above all, is the lordly cupbearer, erect and strong, carrying some precious ointment in a slim blue vase. His face is chiseled by breeding as well as by art. His hair descends in a thick braid upon his brown shoulders. His ears, his neck, his arm, and his waist sparkle with jewelry, and his costly robe is embroidered with a graceful quatrefoil design. Obviously he is no slave, but some aristocratic youth proudly privileged to serve the king. Only a civilization long familiar with order and wealth, leisure and taste, could demand or create such luxury and such ornament. 4. The Fall of Knossos. When in retrospect we seek the origin of this brilliant culture, we find ourselves vacillating between Asia and Egypt. On the one hand, the Cretans seem kin in language, race, and religion to the Indo-European peoples of Asia Minor. Here, too, clay tablets were used for writing, and the shekel was the standard of measurement. There, in Caria, was the cult of Zeus Labrandius, that is, Zeus of the double axe, or Labrys. There men worshipped the pillar, the bull, and the dove. There, in Phrygia, was the great Cybele, so much like the mother goddess of Crete that the Greeks called the latter Rhea Cybele and considered the two divinities one. And yet the signs of Egyptian influence in Crete abound in every age. The two cultures are at first so much alike that some scholars presume a wave of Egyptian emigration to Crete in the troubled days of Menes. The stone vases of Moklos and the copper weapons of early Minoan I are strikingly like those found in proto-dynastic tombs. The double axe appears as an amulet in Egypt, and even a priest of the double axe. The weights and measures, though Asiatic in value, are Egyptian in form. The methods used in the glyptic arts, in faience, and in painting are so similar in the two lands that Spengler reduced Cretan civilization to a mere branch of the Egyptian. We shall not follow him, for it will not do in our search for the continuity of civilization to surrender the individuality of the parts. The Cretan quality is distinct. No other people in antiquity has quite this flavor of minute refinement, this concentrated elegance in life and art. Let us believe that in its racial origins the Cretan culture was Asiatic, in many of its arts Egyptian. In essence and total, it remained unique. Perhaps it belonged to a complex of civilization common to all the eastern Mediterranean, in which each nation inherited kindred arts, beliefs, and ways from a widespread Neolithic culture parent to them all. From that common civilization Crete borrowed in her youth, to it she contributed in her maturity. Her rule forged an order in the isles, and her merchants found entry at every port. Then her wares and her arts pervaded the Cyclades, overran Cyprus, reached to Caria and Palestine, moved north through Asia Minor and its islands to Troy, reached west through Italy and Sicily to Spain, penetrated the mainland of Greece even to Thessaly, and passed through Mycenae and Tiryns into the heritage of Greece. In the history of civilization, Crete was the first link in the European chain. We do not know which of the many roads to decay Crete chose. Perhaps she took them all. Her once famous forests of cypress and cedar vanished. Today 2/3 of the island are a stony waste, incapable of holding the winter rains. Perhaps there, too, as in most declining cultures, population control went too far, and reproduction was left to the failures. Perhaps, as wealth and luxury increased, the pursuit of physical pleasure sapped the vitality of the race and weakened its will to live or to defend itself. A nation is born stoic and dies Epicurean. Possibly the collapse of Egypt after the death of Ikhnaton disrupted Creto-Egyptian trade and diminished the riches of the Minoan kings. Crete had no great internal resources. Her prosperity required commerce and markets for her industries. Like modern England, she had become dangerously dependent upon control of the seas. Perhaps internal wars decimated the island's manhood and left it disunited against foreign attack. Perhaps an earthquake shook the palaces into ruins, or some angry revolution avenged in a year of terror the accumulated oppressions of centuries. About 1450 the palace of Festus was again destroyed, that of Phrygia Triada was burned down, the homes of the rich burghers of Tylissus disappeared. During the next 50 years, Knossos seems to have enjoyed the zenith of her fortune and a supremacy unquestioned throughout the Aegean. Then about 1400 the palace of Knossos itself went up in flames. Everywhere in the ruins Evans found signs of uncontrollable fire, charred beams and pillars, blackened walls, and clay tablets hardened against time's tooth by the conflagration's heat. So thorough was the destruction, and so complete the removal of metal even from rooms covered and protected by debris, that many students suspect invasion and conquest rather than earthquake. In any case, the catastrophe was sudden. The workshops of artists and artisans give every indication of having been in full activity when death arrived. About the same time, Gornia, Pasyra, Zakro, and Palikastro were leveled to the ground. We must not suppose that Cretan civilization vanished overnight. Palaces were built again, but more modestly, and for a generation or two the products of Crete continued to dominate Aegean art. About the middle of the 13th century we come at last upon a specific Cretan personality, that King Minos, of whom Greek tradition told so many frightening tales. His brides were annoyed at the abundance of serpents and scorpions in his seed, but by some secret device his wife Pasiphae eluded these and safely bore him many children, among them Phaedra, wife of Theseus and lover of Hippolytus, and the fair-haired Ariadne. Minos having offended Poseidon, the god afflicted Pasiphae with a mad passion for a divine bull. Daedalus pitied her, and through his contrivance she conceived the terrible Minotaur. Minos imprisoned the animal in the labyrinth which Daedalus had built at his command, but appeased it periodically with human sacrifice. Pleasanter even in its tragedy is the legend of Daedalus, for it opens one of the proudest epics of human history. Greek story represented him as an Athenian Leonardo, who, envious of his nephew's skill, slew him in a moment of temperament, and was banished forever from Greece. He found refuge at Minos's court, astonished him with mechanical inventions and novelties, and became chief artist and engineer to the king. He was a great sculptor, and fable used his name to personify the graduation of statuary from stiff, dead figures to vivid portraits of possible men. The creatures made by him, we are informed, were so lifelike that they stood up and walked away unless they were chained to their pedestals. But Minos was peeved when he learned of Daedalus's connivance with Pasiphae's amours, and confined him and his son Icarus in the maze of the labyrinth. Daedalus fashioned wings for himself and Icarus, and by their aid they leaped across the walls and soared over the Mediterranean. Disdaining his father's counsel, proud Icarus flew too closely to the sun. The hot rays melted the wax on his wings, and he was lost in the sea, pointing a moral and adorning a tale. Daedalus, empty-hearted, flew on to Sicily, and stirred that island to civilization by bringing to it the industrial and artistic culture of Crete. More tragic still is the story of Theseus and Ariadne. Minos, victorious in a war against youthful Athens, exacted from that city every 9th year a tribute of 7 girls and 7 young men to be devoured by the Minotaur. On the coming of the 3rd occasion for this national humiliation, the handsome Theseus, his father King Aegeus reluctantly consenting, had himself chosen as one of the 7 youths, for he was resolved to slay the Minotaur and end the recurrent sacrifice. Ariadne pitied the princely Athenian, loved him, gave him a magic sword, and taught him the simple trick of unraveling thread from his arm as he penetrated the labyrinth. Theseus killed the Minotaur, followed the thread back to Ariadne, and took her with him on his flight from Crete. On the island of Naxos, he married her as he had promised, but while she slept he and his companions sailed treacherously away. With Ariadne and Minos, Crete disappears from history till the coming of Lycurgus to the island, presumably in the 7th century. There are indications that the Achaeans reached it in their long raid of Greece in the 14th and 13th centuries, and Dorian conquerors settled there towards the end of the 2nd millennium before Christ. Here, said many Cretans and some Greeks, Lycurgus, and in less degree Solon, had found the model for their laws. In Crete, as in Sparta, after the island had come under Dorian sway, the ruling class led a life of at least outward simplicity and restraint. The boys were brought up in the army, and the adult males ate together in public mess halls. The state was ruled by a senate of elders, and was administered by 10 kosmoi, or orderers, corresponding to the ephors of Sparta and the archons of Athens. It is difficult to say whether Crete taught Sparta or Sparta Crete. Perhaps both states were the parallel results of similar conditions, the precarious life of an alien military aristocracy amid a native and hostile population of serfs. The comparatively enlightened law code of Cortina, discovered on the walls of that Cretan town in A.D. 1884, belongs apparently to the early 5th century. In an earlier form it may have influenced the legislators of Greece. In the 6th century, Thaletus of Crete taught choral music at Sparta, and the Cretan sculptors Diponus and Sillus instructed the artists of Argos and Sicyon. By 100 channels, the old civilization emptied itself out into the new. Chapter 2. Before Agamemnon. 1. Schliemann. In the year 1822, a lad was born in Germany who was to turn the spade work of archaeology into one of the romances of the century. His father had a passion for ancient history and brought him up on Homer's stories of the siege of Troy and Odysseus's wanderings. With great grief I heard from him that Troy had been so completely destroyed that it had disappeared without leaving any trace of its existence. At the age of 8, having given the matter mature consideration, Heinrich Schliemann announced his intention to devote his life to the rediscovery of the lost city. At the age of 10, he presented to his father a Latin essay on the Trojan War. In 1836 he left school with an education too advanced for his means and became a grocer's apprentice. In 1841 he shipped from Hamburg as cabin boy on a steamer bound for South America. 12 days out the vessel foundered. The crew was tossed about in a small boat for 9 hours and was thrown by the tide upon the shores of Holland. Heinrich became a clerk and earned $150 a year. He spent half of this on books and lived on the other half and his dreams. His intelligence and application had their natural results. At 25 he was an independent merchant with interests on 3 continents. At 36 he felt that he had enough money, retired from commerce, and gave all his time to archaeology. In the midst of the bustle of business I had never forgotten Troy or the agreement I had made with my father to excavate it. In his travels as a merchant he had made it a practice to learn the language of each country he traded with, and to write in that language the current pages of his diary. By this method he learned English, French, Dutch, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Russian, Swedish, Polish, and Arabic. Now he went to Greece, studied the language as a living speech, and was soon able to read both ancient and modern Greek as fluently as German. Henceforth, he declared, I should find it impossible to live anywhere but on classical soil. Since his Russian wife refused to leave Russia, he advertised for a Greek wife, laid down precise specifications for the position, and at the age of 47 chose a bride of 19 from among the photographs he received. He married her almost at sight and unwittingly in the ancient style of purchase. Her parents charged him for her a price commensurate with their conception of his fortune. When his new wife bore him children, he reluctantly consented to baptize them, but solemnized the ceremony by laying a copy of the Iliad upon their heads and reading 100 hexameters aloud. He named them Andromache and Agamemnon, called his servants Telamon and Pelops, and christened his Athenian home Bellerophon. He was an old man mad about Homer. In 1870 he went to the Troad, the northwest corner of Asia Minor, and made up his mind against all current scholarly opinion that Priam's Troy lay buried under the hill called Hisarlik. After a year of negotiations he secured permission from the Turkish government to explore the site. He engaged 80 laborers and set to work. His wife, who loved him for his eccentricities, shared his toil in the earth from sunrise to sunset. All winter long an icy gale from the north drove a blinding dust into their eyes, and swept with such violence through the cracks of their frail cottage that no lamp could be kept lit in the evening. Despite the fire in the hearth, the water froze nearly every night. We had nothing to keep us warm except our enthusiasm for the great work of discovering Troy. A year passed before they were rewarded. Then, blow by blow, a workman's pick exposed a large copper vessel, and this, opened, revealed an astonishing treasure of some 9,000 objects in silver and gold. The canny Schliemann hid the find in his wife's shawl, dismissed his workmen to an unexpected siesta, hurried to his hut, locked the door, spread out the precious things on the table, linked each one fondly with some passage in Homer, adorned his wife with an ancient diadem, and sent messages to his friends in Europe that he had unearthed the treasury of Priam. No one would believe him. Some critics charged him with having placed the objects where he found them. And at the same time the Sublime Porte sued him for taking gold from Turkish soil. But scholars like Virchow, Dürpfeld, and Burnouf came to the site, verified Schliemann's reports, and carried on the work with him until one buried Troy after another was uncovered, and the problem was no longer whether Troy had existed, but which of the 9 Troys exhumed had been the Ilios of the Iliad. In 1876 Schliemann resolved to confirm the epic from another direction, to show that Agamemnon too was real. Guided by Pausanias's classic description of Greece, He sank 34 shafts at Mycenae in the eastern Peloponnesus. Turkish officials interrupted the work by claiming half of the material that he had found at Troy. Unwilling to let the precious treasury of Priam lie unseen in Turkey, Schliemann clandestinely dispatched the objects to the State Museum at Berlin, paid the Porte 5 times more damages than were required of him, and resumed his digging at Mycenae. Again he was rewarded, and when he saw his workers carrying up to him skeletons, pottery, jewelry, and golden masks, he telegraphed joyfully to the king of Greece that he had discovered the tombs of Atreus and Agamemnon. In 1884 he moved on to Tiryns, and, guided again by Pausanias, unearthed the great palace and Cyclopean walls that Homer had described. Seldom had any man done so much for archaeology. He had the faults of his virtues, for his enthusiasm drove him into a reckless haste that destroyed or confused many exhumed objects in order to reach at once the goal that he sought. And the epics that had inspired his labors misled him into thinking that he had discovered Priam's hoard at Troy and the tomb of Agamemnon at Mycenae. The world of scholarship doubted his reports, and the museums of England, Russia, and France long refused to accept as genuine the relics that he found. He consoled himself with vigorous self-appreciation, and went on digging courageously until disease struck him down. In his last days he hesitated whether to pray to the god of Christianity or the Zeus of classic Greece. "To Agamemnon Schliemann, best beloved of sons, greeting," he writes. "I am very glad that you are going to study Plutarch and have finished Xenophon. I pray Zeus the Father and Pallas Athene that they will grant you 100 returns of the day in health and happiness." He died in 1890, worn out by climatic hardships, scholastic hostility, and the incessant fever of his dream. Like Columbus, he had discovered a world stranger than the one he sought. These jewels were older by many centuries than Priam and Hecuba. These graves were not the tombs of the Atridae, but the ruins of an Aegean civilization on the Greek mainland, as ancient as the Minoan age in Crete. Unknowingly, Schliemann had proved Horace's famous line, "Vixerunt fortes ante Agamemnona." There lived many brave men before Agamemnon. Year by year, as Dürpfeld and Müller, Tsuntas and Stamatakis, Waldstein and Wass dug more widely into the Peloponnesus, and still others explored Attica and the islands, Euboea and Boeotia, Phocis and Thessaly, the soil of Greece gave up the ghostly relics of a culture before history. Here, too, men had been lifted from barbarism to civilization by the passage from nomadic hunting to settled agriculture, by the replacement of stone tools with copper and bronze, by the conveniences of writing and the stimulus of trade. Civilization is always older than we think, and under whatever sod we tread are the bones of men and women who also worked and loved, wrote songs and made beautiful things, but whose names and very being have been lost in the careless flow of time. 2. In the palaces of the kings. On a long low hill 5 miles east of Argos and a mile north of the sea stood, in the 14th century before our era, the fortress palace of Tiryns. Today one reaches its ruins by a pleasant ride from Argos or Nauplia, and finds them half lost amid quiet fields of corn and wheat. Then, after a little climb up prehistoric stone steps, the traveler stands before the Cyclopean walls built, said Greek tradition, for the Argive prince Proetus, 2 centuries before the Trojan War. The Greeks gave the name Cyclopean to such structures as in their mythical fancy could have been built only by giants like the one-eyed titans called Cyclopes, or Round Eyes, who labored at the forges of Hephaestus in the volcanoes of the Mediterranean. Architecturally, the term implied large unmortared stones, unhewn or roughly cut, and filled in at the joints with pebbles laid in clay. Tradition added that Proetus had imported celebrated masons called Cyclopes from Lycia. Even then the town itself was old, having been founded, said ancient memory, by the hero Tiryns, son of Argus of the 100 Eyes, in the infancy of the world. Proteus, the story went on, gave the palace to Perseus, who ruled Tiryns with the dusky Andromeda as his queen. The walls that protected the citadel rose from 25 to 50 feet in height, and were so thick that at several places they contained spacious galleries, vaulted and arched with immense overlapping horizontal slabs. Many of the stones, still in place, measure 6 feet in length by 3 in breadth and depth. The smallest of them, said Pausanias, could hardly be moved by a pair of mules. Within the walls, behind a propylon or gateway that set a style for many an acropolis, lay a broad paved court bounded with colonnades. And around this, as at Knossos, was a medley of rooms gathered about the Megaron. a hall of state 1,300 square feet in area, with a pavement of painted cement and a ceiling supported by 4 columns enclosing a hearth. Here, in contrast to merry Crete, was established a lasting principle of Greek architecture, the separation of the women's quarters, or gynoeceum, from the chambers of the men. The king's room and the queen's room were built side by side, but so far as the remains reveal, they were eremitically sealed against intercommunication. Of this palace castle, Schliemann found only the ground plan, the column bases, and portions of the wall. At the foot of the hill were the remnants of stone or brick houses and bridges, and some fragments of archaic pottery. There, in prehistoric days, the town of Tiryns huddled for protection below the palace walls. We must picture the life of Bronze Age Greece as moving insecurely around and within such feudal fortresses. 10 miles farther north, perhaps in the 14th century before Christ, Perseus, if we wish to believe Pausanias, built Mycenae, the greatest capital of prehistoric Greece. Here, too, around a forbidding citadel, a town of several villages grew, housing a busy population of peasants, merchants, artisans, and slaves who had the happiness of eluding history. 600 years later, Homer called Mycenae a well-built city, broad-avenued and abounding in gold. Despite 100 despoiling generations, some parts of these also Cyclopean walls survive to attest the immemorial cheapness of labor and uneasiness of kings. In a corner of the wall is the famous Lion Gate, where, carved upon a stone triangle over a massive lintel, 2 royal beasts, now worn and headless, dumbly stand guard over a grandeur that is gone. On the Acropolis beyond are the ruins of the palace. Again, as at Tiryns and Knossos, we can trace the divisions of throne room, altar room, store rooms, bathroom, and reception rooms. Here once were painted floors, columned porticos, frescoed walls, and majestic flights of stairs. Near the Lion Gate, in a narrow area enclosed by a ring of erect stone slabs, Schliemann's workers dug up 19 skeletons and relics so rich that one could forgive the great amateur for seeing in these shafts the burial chambers of the children of Atreus. Had not Pausanias described the royal graves as in the ruins of Mycenae? Here were male skulls with crowns of gold and golden masks on the bones of the face. Here were osseous ladies with golden diadems on what had been their heads. Here were painted vases, bronze cauldrons, a silver rhyton, beads of amber and amethyst, objects of alabaster, ivory, or faience, heavily ornamented daggers and swords, a gaming board like that at Knossos, and almost anything in gold, seals and rings, pins and studs, cups and beads, bracelets and breastplates, vessels of toilet, even clothing embroidered with thin plates of gold. These were assuredly royal jewels, royal bones. In the hillside opposite the Acropolis, Schliemann and others discovered 9 tombs altogether different from these shaft graves. Leaving the road that comes down from the citadel, one enters at the right a corridor lined with walls of large, well-cut stones. At the end is a plain portal, once adorned with slim cylindrical columns of green marble, now in the British Museum. Above it is a simple lintel of 2 stones, one extending 30 feet and weighing 113 tons. Within, the traveler finds himself under a dome, or tholos, 50 feet high and as many wide. The walls are built of sawn blocks reinforced with decorative bronze rosettes. Each stratum of stones overlaps the one beneath until the uppermost layer closes the top. This strange structure, Schliemann thought, was the tomb of Agamemnon, and a smaller tholos nearby, discovered by his wife, was at once described as the tomb of Clytemnestra. All the beehive tombs at Mycenae were found empty. Thieves had anticipated the archaeologists by several centuries. These gloomy ruins are the reminders of a civilization as ancient to Pericles as Charlemagne to ourselves. Current opinion dates the shaft graves near to 1600 B.C., some 400 years before the traditional age of Agamemnon, and the beehive tombs about 1450. But prehistoric chronology is not a precision tool. We do not know how this civilization began, nor what people it was that built towns not only at Mycenae and Tiryns, but at Sparta, Amyclae, Aegina, Eleusis, Chaeronea, or Kamenos and Delphi. Probably, like most nations, it was already composite in stock and heritage. Greece was as diverse in blood before the Dorian invasion of 1100 B.C. as England before the Norman conquest. So far as we can guess, the Mycenaeans were akin to the Phrygians and Carians of Asia Minor, and to the Minoans of Crete. The lions of Mycenae have a Mesopotamian countenance. This ancient motif probably came through Assyria and Phrygia to Greece. Greek tradition called the Mycenaeans Pelasgi. possibly meaning people of the sea, Pelagos, and pictured them as coming down from Thrace and Thessaly into Attica and the Peloponnesus in a past so distant that the Greeks termed them autochthanoi, aborigines. Herodotus accepted this account and ascribed the Olympian gods to a Pelasgic origin, but he could not say with any certainty what the language of the Pelasgi was. No more can we. Doubtless these autochthanoi were themselves latecomers into a land that had suffered cultivation since Neolithic days. There are no aborigines. In their turn, they too were overrun, for in the later years of Mycenaean history, towards 1600, we find many indications of a cultural, commercial, if not a military-political, conquest of the Peloponnesus by the products or emigrants of Crete. The palaces at Tiryns and Mycenae, except for the Gynoeceum, were designed and decorated in the Minoan manner. Cretan vases and styles reached into Aegina, Chalcis, and Thebes. Mycenaean ladies and goddesses adopted the charming fashions of Crete, and the art revealed in the later shaft graves is unmistakably Minoan. Apparently it was this stimulating contact with the higher culture that lifted Mycenae to the peak of its civilization. 3. Mycenaean civilization. The remains of this culture are too fragmentary to give us a picture as distinct as those that take form in the ruins of Crete or the poetry of Homer. Life on the mainland was a little nearer to the hunting stage than in Crete. The bones of deer, wild boars, goats, sheep, hares, oxen, and pigs among the Mycenaean leavings, not to speak of fish bones and marine shells, indicate an appetite already Homeric and unfriendly to the Cretan waste. Here and there the relics reveal the strange contemporaneity of ancient and modern modes. Obsidian arrowheads lying beside a hollow bronze drill apparently used in boring dowel holes into stones. Industry was less advanced than in Crete. There are no signs on the mainland of such industrial centers as Gornia. Trade grew slowly, for the seas were troubled with pirates, including the Mycenaeans. The kings of Mycenae and Tiryns had Cretan artists engrave for them on their vases and rings a proud record of their achievements in piracy. To protect themselves against other pirates, they built their cities inland, far enough from the sea to guard against sudden attack, close enough to take readily to their ships. Lying on the road from the Argolic Gulf to the Isthmus of Corinth, Tiryns and Mycenae were well situated both to plunder traders with feudal tolls and to set out occasionally on buccaneering raids. Seeing Crete grow rich on orderly trade, Mycenae learned that piracy, like its civilized offspring, tariff dues, can strangle commerce and internationalize poverty. It reformed and allowed piracy to subside into trade. By 1400, its mercantile fleet was strong enough to defy the sea power of Crete. It refused to ship its Africa-bound goods across the island, but sent them directly to Egypt. Possibly this was the cause or result of a war that ended in the destruction of the Cretan citadels. The wealth that grew from this trade was not accompanied by any commensurate culture visible in the remains. Greek tradition credited the Pelasgians with having learned the alphabet from Phoenician traders. At Tiryns and Thebes, some jars have been found bearing unintelligible characters, but no clay tablets or inscriptions or documents have been discovered. Probably when Mycenae decided to be literate, it used perishable writing materials, as the Cretans did in their final period, and nothing has been preserved. In art, the Mycenaeans followed Cretan models, and so faithfully that archaeology suspects them of importing their major artists from Crete. But after Cretan art declined, painting flourished vigorously on the mainland. The decorative designs of borders and cornices are of the first order and persist into classic Greece, while the surviving frescoes indicate a keen feeling for moving life. The ladies in the box are splendid dowagers who might adorn any opera promenade today and be in full fashion of coiffure and gowns. They are more alive than the stiffly conscious ladies in the chariot who are out for an afternoon drive in the park. Better still is the boar hunt, a fresco from Tiryns. The boar and the flowers are unconvincingly conventional. The incredibly pink hounds are disfigured with stylized spots of scarlet, black, or blue, and the hindquarters of the plunging boar taper away into the likeness of some high-heeled maiden falling from her palace bower. Nevertheless, the chase is real, the boar is desperate, the dogs are in fast flight through the air, and man, the most sentimental and terrible of all beasts of prey, stands ready with his murderous spear. One may suspect from such samples the active and physical life of the Mycenaeans, the proud beauty of their women, the vivid adornment of their palaces. The highest art of Mycenae was in metals. This book is continued on Cassette 2, Side 1. The Story of Civilization, Volume 2, The Life of Greece, Part 1, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 2, Side 1. The highest art of Mycenae was in metals. Here the mainland equaled Crete and dared to use its own forms and decoration. If Schliemann did not quite find the bones of Agamemnon, he found their weight in silver and gold. Jewelry of many kinds, in spendthrift quantities, stud buttons worthy of any king, intaglios live with scenes of hunting, war, or piracy, and a cow's head in shining silver, with horns and frontal rosette of gold. At any moment one expects from it the plaintive mooing to which Schliemann, never at a loss for explanations, traced the name Mycenae, Mykenai. The finest of these metal relics from Tiryns and Mycenae are two bronze daggers inlaid with electron and burnished gold, and elegantly engraved with wildcats chasing ducks, and lions pursuing leopards or fighting men. Most peculiar of all the remains are the golden masks apparently laid over the faces of dead royalty. One mask looks for all the world like the face of a cat. However, the gallant Schliemann ascribed it not to Clytemnestra, but to Agamemnon. The unquestioned masterpieces of Mycenaean art were found neither at Tiryns nor at Mycenae, but in a tomb at Vaphio, near Sparta, where a minor prince once emulated the magnificence of the northern kings. Here, amid another treasure of jewelry, were two thin cups of beaten gold, simply formed and yet worked with loving patience of all great art. The craftsmanship is so like the best Minoan that most students are inclined to attribute these cups to some Cretan Cellini, but it would be a pity to deprive the Mycenaean culture of its most perfect memorials. The subject, the snaring and taming of a bull, seems characteristically Cretan, and yet the frequency with which such scenes are engraved upon Mycenaean rings and seals or painted upon the palace walls shows that the bull sport was as popular on the mainland as on the island. On one of the cups the bull is caught in a net of heavy rope. His mouth and nostrils gape with breathless anger and fatigue as he struggles to get free and imprisons himself the more. While on the other side a second bull gallops off in terror, and a third charges at a cowboy who catches it bravely by the horns. On the companion cup, the captured bull is being led away. As we turn the vessel around, we see him already reconciled to the restraints of civilization and engaged, as Evans puts it, in amorous conversation with a cow. Many centuries were to pass before such skillful work would appear again in Greece. The Mycenaean himself, as well as most of his art, is found in the tombs. For he folded and buried his dead in comfortable jars, and seldom cremated them as the heroic age would do. Apparently he believed in a future life, for many objects of use and value were placed in the graves. For the rest, Mycenaean religion, so far as it reveals itself to us, gives every evidence of Cretan origin or kinship. Here as in Crete are the double axe, the sacred pillar, the holy dove, and the cult of a mother goddess associated with a young male deity, presumably her son. And here again are attendant divinities in the form of snakes. Through all the transformations of religion known to us in Greece, the mother goddess has remained. After the Cretan Rhea came Demeter, the Mater Dolorosa of the Greeks, after Demeter, the Virgin Mother of God. Today, standing on the ruins of Mycenae, one sees in the little village below a modest Christian church. Grandeur is gone, simplicity and consolation remain. Civilizations come and go, they conquer the earth and crumble into dust, but faith survives every desolation. After the fall of Knossos, Mycenae prospered as never before. The rising wealth of the Shaft-Grave dynasty raised great palaces upon the hills of Mycenae and Tiryns. Mycenaean art took on a character of its own and captured the markets of the Aegean. Now the commerce of the mainland princes reached eastward into Cyprus and Syria, southward through the Cyclades to Egypt, westward through Italy to Spain, northward through Boeotia and Thessaly to the Danube, and found itself balked only at Troy. Like Rome absorbing and disseminating the civilization of Hellas, so Mycenae, won by the culture of dying Crete, spread the Mycenaean phase of that culture throughout the Mediterranean world. 4. Troy. Between the Greek mainland and Crete, 220 islands dot the Aegean, forming a circle around Delos, and therefore called the Cyclades. Most of them are rugged and barren, precarious mountain survivals of a land half drowned in the sea. But some were rich enough in marble or metal to be already busy and civilized, as the world goes, long before Greek history comes into our view. In 1896, the British School of Athens dug into the soil of Melos at Philokopi and found tools, weapons, and pottery remarkably akin, age by age, to the Minoan. and a like research in other islands, has built up a prehistoric picture of the Cyclades conforming in time and character, though never comparable in artistic excellence, with the bioscope of Crete. The Cyclades were cramped for land, totaling less than 1,000 square miles among them, and proved, like classic Greece, incapable of uniting under one political power. By the 17th century B.C., the little isles had passed in government and art, even here and there in language and writing, under Cretan domination. Then in the final period, 1400 to 1200, the imports from Crete fell away, and the islands increasingly took their pottery and their styles from Mycenae. Moving eastward into the Sporades, or scattered, islands, we find in Rhodes another prehistoric culture of the simpler Aegean type. In Cyprus, the rich deposits of copper that gave the island its name brought it a measure of wealth throughout the Bronze Age, 3400 to 1200, but its wares remained crude and undistinguished before the coming of Cretan influence. Its population, predominantly Asiatic, used a syllabic script akin to the Minoan and worshipped a goddess apparently descended from the Semitic Ishtar and destined to become the Aphrodite of the Greeks. After 1600, the metal industry of the island developed rapidly. The mines, owned by the royal government, exported copper to Egypt, Crete, and Greece. The foundry at Enkomi made famous daggers, and the potters sold their globular bowls from Egypt to Troy. The forests were cut into timber, and Cyprus, from Cyprus, began to compete with the cedars of Lebanon. In the 13th century, Mycenaean colonists founded the colonies that were to become the Greek cities of Paphos, sacred to Aphrodite, and Citium, birthplace of the Stoic Zeno, and Cyprian Salamis, where Solon paused in his wanderings to replace chaos with law. From Cyprus, Mycenaean trade and influence crossed to Syria and Caria, and thence, as well as by other rowing stones, they moved up the coasts and islands of Asia until they reached Troy. There, on a hill separated by 3 miles from the sea, Schliemann and Dürpfeld found 9 cities superimposed each upon its predecessor, as if Troy had had 9 lives. 1. In the lowest strata were the remains of a Neolithic village coming down to 3000 B.C. Here were walls of rough stones, mortared with mud, clay whorls, bits of worked ivory, tools of obsidian, and pieces of hand-polished black pottery. 2. Above this lay the ruins of the second city, which Schliemann believed to have been Homer's Troy. Its enclosing walls, like those of Tiryns and Mycenae, were of Cyclopean stones. At intervals there were fortresses, and at the corners great double gates, of which 2 are well preserved. Some houses survived to a height of 4 feet, their walls built of brick and wood upon a stone foundation. The red-painted pottery, wheel-turned but crude, indicates a lifespan for this city from approximately 2400 to 1900. Bronze has replaced stone for tools and weapons, and jewelry abounds, but the statuettes are unprepossessingly primitive. The second city was apparently destroyed by fire. Signs of conflagration are numerous, and persuaded Schliemann that this was the work of Agamemnon's Greeks. 3 to 5. Above the burnt city are the relics of 3 successive hamlets, small and poor, and negligible in archaeological content. 6. About 1600 another city rose on the historic hill. Through the passionate haste of his work, Schliemann mixed the objects of this stratum with those of the second, and dismissed the 6th city as an unimportant Lydian settlement. But Dürpfeld, continuing the excavations after Schliemann's death, and for a time with Schliemann's money, revealed a town considerably larger than the second, ornate with substantial buildings in dressed stone, and enclosed by a 30-foot wall, of whose 4 gates 3 remain. In the ruins were monochrome vases of finer workmanship than before, vessels like the Minian ware of Orchomenos, and potsherds so like those found at Mycenae that Dürpfeld considered them to be importations from that city, and therefore contemporary with the Shaftgrave dynasty, 1400 to 1200. On these and other shifting grounds, current opinion identifies the 6th city with Homer's Troy, and assigns to it the treasury of Priam that Schliemann thought he had found in the second city: 6 bracelets, 2 goblets, 2 diadems, a fillet, 60 earrings, and 8,700 other pieces, all in gold. The 6th city, too, we are assured, perished by fire shortly after 1200. Greek historians traditionally assigned the siege of Troy to 1194 to 1184 B.C. Who were the Trojans? An Egyptian papyrus mentions certain Dardanui as among the allies of the Hittites at the Battle of Kadesh in 1287. It is likely that these were the ancestors of the Dardanoi, who in Homer's terminology are one with the Trojans. Probably these Dardani were of Balkan origin, crossed the Hellespont in the 16th century with the kindred Phrygians, and settled in the lower valley of the Scamander. Herodotus, however, identified the Trojans with the Teucrians, and the Teucrians, according to Strabo, were Cretans who settled in the Troad, perhaps after the fall of Knossos. Both Crete and the Troad had a sacred Mount Ida, the many-fountained Ida of Homer and Tennyson. Presumably the region was subject at various times to political and ethnic influences from the Hittite hinterland. All in all, the excavations indicate a civilization partly Minoan, partly Mycenaean, partly Asiatic, partly Danubian. Homer represents the Trojans as speaking the same language and worshipping the same gods as the Greeks, but later Hellenic imagination preferred to think of Troy as an Asiatic city, and of the famous siege as the first known episode in an endless contest between Semite and Aryan, east and west. More significant than the racial complexion of its people was the strategic position of Troy near the entrance to the Hellespont and the rich lands about the Black Sea. Throughout history, that narrow passage has been the battleground of empires. The siege of Troy was the Gallipoli adventure of 1194 B.C. The plain was moderately fertile, and precious metals lay in the soil to the east, but this alone would hardly account for the wealth of Troy and the tenacious attack of the Greeks. The city was admirably placed to levy tolls upon vessels wishing to pass through the Hellespont, while it was too far inland to be conveniently assailed from the sea. Perhaps it was this, and not Helen's face, that launched 1,000 ships upon Ilium. On a likelier theory, the southward current and winds in the strait persuaded merchants to unload their cargoes at Troy and ship them overland into the interior. From the charges exacted for this service, Troy may have derived its wealth and power. In any case, the city's trade grew rapidly, as may be judged from the varied provenance of its remains. From the lower Aegean came copper, olive oil, wine, and pottery. From the Danube and Thrace came pottery, amber, horses, and swords. From distant China came so great a rarity as jade. In return, Troy brought from the interior and exported timber, silver, gold, and wild asses. Seated proudly behind their walls, the horse-taming Trojans dominated the Troad and taxed its trade on land and sea. The picture that we derive from the Iliad of Priam and his household is one of biblical grandeur and patriarchal benevolence. The king is polygamous, not as a diversion, but as a royal responsibility to continue his high breed abundantly. His sons are monogamous, and as well behaved as the fictitious Victorians, excepting, of course, the gay Paris, who is as innocent of morals as Alcibiades. Hector, Helenus, and Troilus are more likable than the vacillating Agamemnon, the treacherous Odysseus, and the petulant Achilles. Andromache and Polyxena are as charming as Helen and Iphigenia, and Hecuba is a shade better than Clytemnestra. All in all, the Trojans, as pictured by their enemies, seem to us less deceitful, more devoted, better gentlemen than the Greeks who conquered them. The conquerors themselves felt this in later days. Homer had many a kind word to say for the Trojans, and Sappho and Euripides left no doubt as to where their sympathies and admiration lay. It was a pity that these noble Dardans stood in the way of an expanding Greece, which, despite its multitude of faults, would in the end bring to this and every other region of the Mediterranean a higher civilization than they had ever known. Chapter 3. The Heroic Age. 1. The Achaeans. Modest Hittite tablets from Bogaz-Kui of approximately 1325 B.C. speak of the Ahiava as a people equal in power to the Hittites themselves. An Egyptian record towards 1221 B.C. mentions the Akaiwasha as joining other peoples of the sea in a Libyan invasion of Egypt and describes them as a roving band fighting to fill their bellies. In Homer, the Achaeans are specifically a Greek-speaking people of southern Thessaly. Often, however, because they had become the most powerful of the Greek tribes, Homer uses their name for all the Greeks at Troy. Greek historians and poets of the Classic Age called the Achaeans, like the Pelasgians, autochthonous, native to Greece as far back as memory could recall, and they assumed without hesitation that the Achaean culture described in Homer was one with that which has here been termed Mycenaean. Schliemann accepted this identification, and for a brief while the world of scholarship agreed with him. In 1901, an unusually iconoclastic Englishman, Sir William Ridgway, upset this happy confidence by pointing out that though Achaean civilization agreed with the Mycenaean in many ways, it differed in vital particulars. 1. Iron is practically unknown to the Mycenaeans. The Achaeans are familiar with it. 2. The dead in Homer are cremated. In Tiryns and Mycenae they are buried, implying a different conception of the afterlife. 3. The Achaean gods are the Olympians, of whom no trace has been found in the culture of Mycenae. 4. The Achaeans used long swords, round shields, and safety pin brooches. No objects of such form appear in the buried Mycenaean remains. 5. There are considerable dissimilarities in coiffure and dress. Ridgway concluded that the Mycenaeans were Pelasgians and spoke Greek, that the Achaeans were blond Celts, or Central Europeans, who came down through Epirus and Thessaly from 2000 onward, brought with them the worship of Zeus, invaded the Peloponnesus about 1400, adopted Greek speech and many Greek ways, and established themselves as feudal chieftains, ruling from their fortress palaces a subjugated Pelasgian population. The theory is illuminating, even if it must be substantially modified. Greek literature says nothing of an Achaean invasion, and it would not be wise to hang a rejection of so unanimous a tradition upon a gradual increase in the use of iron, a change in modes of burial or coiffure, a lengthening of swords or rounding of shields, or even a safety pin. It is more likely that the Achaeans, as all classic writers supposed, were a Greek tribe that, in its natural multiplication, expanded from Thessaly into the Peloponnesus during the 14th and 13th centuries, mingled their blood with the Pelasgo-Mycenaeans there, and towards 1250 B.C. became the ruling class. Probably it was they who gave Greek to the Pelasgians, instead of receiving it from them. In such place names as Corinth and Tiryns, Parnassus and Olympia, we may have echoes of a Creto-Pelasgo-Mycenaean tongue. In the same manner, presumably, the Achaeans superimposed their mountain and sky gods upon the chthonic or subterranean deities of the earlier population. For the rest, there is no sharp line of separation between the Mycenaean culture and that later phase of it, the Achaean, which we find in Homer. The two ways of life seem to have mingled and melted into one. Slowly, as the amalgamation proceeded, Aegean civilization passed away, dying in the defeat of Troy, and Greek civilization began. 2. The heroic legends. The legends of the heroic age suggest both the origins and the destinies of the Achaeans. We must not ignore these stories, for though a sanguinary fancy enlivens them, they may contain more history than we suppose, and they are so bound up with the Greek poetry, drama, and art that we should be at a loss to understand these without them. The Cambridge Ancient History states, Perseus, Heracles, Minos, Theseus, Jason. It has been common in modern times to regard these and the other heroes of this age as purely mythical creations. The later Greeks, in criticizing the records of their past, had no doubt that they were historical persons who actually ruled in Argos and other kingdoms. And after a period of extreme skepticism, many modern critics have begun to revert to the Greek view as that which explains the evidence most satisfactorily. The heroes of the tales, like the geographical scenes in which they moved, are real. We shall assume that the major legends are true in essence, imaginative in detail. Hittite inscriptions mention an Atarisius as king of the Ahiavas in the 13th century B.C. He is probably Atreus, king of the Achaeans. In Greek story, Zeus begat Tantalus, king of Phrygia, who begat Pelops, who begat Atreus, who begat Agamemnon. Pelops, being exiled, came to Elis in the western Peloponnesus about 1283, and determined to marry Hippodamia, daughter of Enamaeus, Elis's king. The east pediment of the great temple of Zeus at Olympia still tells us the story of their courtship. The king made a practice to test his daughter's suitors by competing with them in a chariot race. If the suitor won, he would receive Hippodamia. If he lost, he was put to death. Several suitors had tried and had lost both race and life. To reduce the risks, Pelops bribed the king's charioteer, Myrtilus, to remove the linchpins from the royal chariot and promised to share the kingdom with him if their plan succeeded. In the contest that ensued, the king's chariot broke down and he was killed. Pelops married Hippodamia and ruled Elis, but instead of sharing the kingdom with Myrtilus, he threw Myrtilus into the sea. As Myrtilus sank, he laid an ominous curse upon Pelops and all his descendants. Pelops' daughter married Sthenelus, son of Perseus and king of Argos. The throne passed down to their son Eurystheus, and after the latter's death to his uncle Atreus. Atreus' sons Agamemnon and Menelaus married Clytemnestra and Helen, daughters of King Tyndareus of Lacedaemon. And when Atreus and Tyndareus died, Agamemnon and Menelaus between them ruled all the eastern Peloponnesus from their respective capitals at Mycenae and Sparta. The Peloponnesus, or island of Pelops, came to be called after their grandfather, whose descendants had quite forgotten the curse of Myrtilus. Meanwhile, the remainder of Greece was also busy with heroes, usually founding cities. In the 15th century before our era, said Greek tradition, the iniquity of the human race provoked Zeus to overwhelm it with a flood, from which one man, Deucalion, and his wife Pyrrha alone were saved, in an ark or chest that came to rest on Mount Parnassus. From Deucalion's son Hellen, Hellen, had come all the Greek tribes and their united name, Hellenes. Hellen was grandfather of Achaeus and Ion, who begot the Achaean and Ionian tribes, which, after many wanderings, peopled respectively the Peloponnesus and Attica. One of Ion's descendants, Cecrops, with the help of the goddess Athena, founded, on a site whose acropolis had already been settled by Pelasgians, the city that was named after her, Athens. It was he, said the story, that gave civilization to Attica, instituted marriage, abolished bloody sacrifices, and taught his subjects to worship the Olympian gods, Zeus and Athena above the rest. The descendants of Cecrops ruled Athens as kings. The fourth in line was Erechtheus, to whom the city, honoring him